So, Holly, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about the female body and how to really optimize our training and nutrition for kind of the ultimate edge in fitness. Firstly, a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I guess the first thing is, can you give listeners a little bit about your background? How did you get into bodybuilding?
Yeah, so it's funny, long story, but I'll try to keep it brief for the key points. I think originally I was pretty sporty as a kid. So I did every sport you could think of, but my favorites were, basketball. I did track sprinting and athletics. And I competed at a very high level back when I was living in Australia. So I'm located in Florida, USA now, recently relocated in 2017. But I guess growing up in Australia, there weren't really a whole lot of opportunities as a young female to pursue a career in sport. And it was really unfortunate because I loved it. And I think I kind of got to that point where you're making some pretty big decisions about, going off to college or pursuing my dream to be like an Olympic athlete, and it just didn't weigh up for me. So I guess the closest thing to that was to put myself in, from an educational standpoint, to kind of work with these people. So I went off and did a master's in dietetics, and I also did an undergraduate in food science and nutrition. So I kind of threw myself in from the nutrition standpoint. That was obviously a really important part of my training. And it actually also contributed to a lifetime of disordered eating, which I'm sure we'll get into maybe at some point throughout the podcast today. But I definitely had a very strong focus on, how to optimize my physique for my performance. So after kind of graduating from my master's, I went off and did clinical dietetics for a little while and found myself kind of working across a wide range of different patient groups. So interestingly, dietitians actually work with quite a few unique subsets of populations, probably more than I guess the average person would know about. I think if I quizzed, 9 out of 10 people would say, hey, yeah, they work for, fat loss or weight loss predominantly. But we actually work with cardiothoracic patients. We work with infectious disease, hepatic, liver patients, people with kidney problems, and a host of other different disease states. So I found that when I was working in that clinical environment, the people there were so opposing to my, motivations. They didn't have that drive to be healthy. They didn't want to be refining and tailoring their nutrition to, optimize their health or, their longevity. It was really, really depressing. And, I just didn't find that very fulfilling. So after, I think it was about 18 months, I stayed in the clinical space, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's making me miserable. You've got these patients there that are being referred by their doctor that don't even want to be there. So I opened my own practice, and I also kind of around the same time opened up a gym and was running an unlimited number of boot camps to our participants, people that would join up and become members of our club. And then I was also doing clinical dietetics, but with people that were more sports specific. So that was right up my alley. These people were motivated. They were full fee paying. They wanted to be there, and I just loved it. So it wasn't until I started working with physique competitors to kind of optimize their body composition for their shows that I even really knew about bodybuilding. That was not even on my radar when I was, a young teenager. So it was a client of mine that I was working with who suggested, hey, have you ever thought about competing? You're kind of very sporty and athletic. So the only reason that I really jumped into the world of bodybuilding, at least, and becoming a physique competitor was that the World Championships in 2015 were being held in Dubai. And that was one place that I'd always wanted to travel. Australians, we just love traveling. So yeah, in order to get to the World Championships, we had to win our state shows and then qualify at nationals, place in top 3. and then you could go and compete for your country. So that was my first kind of, I guess, step into the world of physique competitions. And then I guess the rest is really history. Everything that I've done since then certainly has a connection with body composition, but my take and my stance on physique sports has really changed. And part of that is just because of my own, I guess, healing journey through, my eating disorder over those years, and having now come out the other side some 15 years later, I have an appreciation for that sport, and I still compete, which is kind of a funny dichotomy, but, and I can talk about why, but I really feel like all the products and services now that I am involved in and that we provide are tailored to females, probably who have experienced similar things to myself, that are trying to improve not only their health, but, their body composition. So yeah, I am involved in a lot of different things, and certainly take the stance of an evidence-based approach. So I would say we are a science-based company.
Perfect. And your videos actually are so inspiring. I've done a few of your workouts myself.
Oh,
I think, yeah, I've done there's an amazing one that you put out all on shoulders, and I was like, oh my God, I haven't thought about doing so many different exercises for shoulders. Like, your YouTube channel is amazing. And I guess with that background, you were talking there about eating disorders and your background in dietetics, presumably you approach this sport from a very health conscious perspective, right? Because there's a healthy way to compete and an unhealthy way. I'd like to kind of dive into some of that with you. I guess, first of all, when we look at it from a nutrition perspective, when someone's looking to make body composition changes, what are the key things that you think they should focus on?
I think if anyone's just trying to improve their physique, and I mean, I immediately think of, reducing body fat, but also simultaneously increasing lean body mass. I guess the best way that we can, achieve that is through incorporating a high protein diet, and then moderating our caloric intake. And there are a plethora of ways that we can do that, which is why we tend to see so many different types of dietary approaches, having a lot of success. And I think it's really important to recognize that everybody has like a unique preference for certain foods. And I think it's important to, perhaps try the plethora of dietary approaches out there until you can find one that actually resonates with you. Because if we look at all of the research on what are the most predominant characteristics that are linked to long-term weight loss maintenance, it tends to be compliance or dietary adherence. So you've got to find something that you really like, that you can stick to long term. And then I guess the other thing that's really important then is just finding some kind of activity, exercise, doesn't really matter what it is, but something that gets you moving. And hopefully it's something that you can enjoy in the process. So they're really the three key things I think that lead to long-term healthy bodies. And, at the same time, the value add is maybe a good looking physique too.
Yeah, which is a welcome side effect. But you're so right. I mean, if you don't enjoy exercise or you don't enjoy the way you're eating, you're never going to stick with it. And that adherence is so key, isn't it? When you're looking at kind of macronutrients, obviously like the protein consideration there, I'm always telling my clients, increase the protein, increase the protein. I think people struggle with this. Do you generally advocate that it's around a gram per pound of body weight in terms of getting the sweet spot for that body composition?
Yeah, look, I think if we were to look at all of the science on that specific topic, if we're looking at protein requirements for the purposes of hypertrophy, so building muscle, it tends to be within a certain range. So I think 1 gram per pound of lean body mass up to about 1.3 grams per pound of lean body mass, or for anyone that's listening from the rest of the world and that they use the metric of grams per kilogram, I like to use the range of say 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of lean body mass, up to about 2.9 grams of protein per kilogram of lean body mass. So the beauty is it's a range. So there isn't one particular point along that range that is going to be, optimal. Now, maybe if you err on the side or the higher end of that range, and we look at maybe like a 15-year, training lifespan, perhaps if you sat at the upper end of that range, you may have a small but significant increase in your lean body mass over that time frame than sitting at the lower end. But I think ultimately, we've got to be able to find a balanced or an amount of protein that works with your dietary preferences, because the science can point, all things towards high protein, but if you really aren't an advocate of protein and, it means that you're sacrificing, carbohydrates and dietary fats that are also, important to you as an individual for long-term, sustainability of that diet, then it's more likely that you're going to end up over-consuming your calories. And then ultimately, if that's done consistently over many years, then you're not going to achieve at least the level of leanness that you want, because total calorie intake paired with protein are like the two predominant factors that we would be looking for the optimal, physique.
And have you found any within that, once you've got those two things kind of nailed, have you found any differences with the proportion of fats and carbs? Like for me, I just find nuts and nut butters so addictive. And it's the easiest way for me to drop off in terms of that lean scale a little bit. And when I dial that back, but I think that's very individual. Right? Some people seem to be more sensitive than others. I'm curious as to what you found.
Yeah, so again, if we were to cite the latest research in fat loss, so we look at all of the weight loss studies, and this would be in obese populations and healthy, normal body weight individuals, there doesn't seem to be any advantages between a diet that is high in carbohydrate and low in fat, provided that calories and protein are held constant, versus a diet that is high in fat and low in carbohydrate. It really doesn't seem to make much of an impact on someone's ability to lose body fat. Overall, what is going to govern that rate of weight loss really is the degree of the calorie deficit, and then the consistency with a high protein diet. So that's actually really good news, because it means that there is so much more dietary options for people, if they're looking to shed a little bit of excess body fat and improve their overall health and wellness.
Yeah, and I suppose the thing with fats, right, is they're more calorific and they're very easy to overeat.
Yeah, I just want to add in like terrific as well. I'm such a nut butter fan as well. I think I have like 7 different containers in my pantry at the moment for different flavors and things. But that's the thing. I think the beauty of it is that you don't have to subscribe to one or the other. I used to be very rigid in my approach to my nutrition prior to kind of, reading more about, the research on, the ratio of carbohydrates and fats in relation to fat loss. And I would really try so hard to hit one specific number. And I would have the same target of carbohydrates and fats like every single day. And I think the beauty of, the scientific field is that there is so many more studies being done, and we now know that you can chop and change. It doesn't mean that you have to subscribe to one all the time. So for me, and I know for a lot of my clients, I only give them a calorie target and a protein target, and they really have the liberty to change out, their remaining calories based on how they're feeling. What are you in the mood for from a satiation standpoint? And there are some times where it's really important that we focus on satiety from a gut fullness perspective, but then there are other times when it's also important to focus on gut satiety and how we perceive that food. Is it pleasurable? Do we get joy from that food? So it's important to strike a nice balance between those, and you have the flexibility to do that. So yeah, I definitely oscillate between carbs and fats, most days. But the downside to something like that is that for people that are perhaps new to tracking macros, for instance, it is a little bit more work. And, there's some math. I mean, if you've got a certain amount of calories remaining in a day from carbs and fats, And ultimately, you can put them all towards carbs if you wanted to, and have, basically a carb only type meal. And a good example might be like, I don't know, some cinnamon toast crunch cereal, and then, some kind of milk product on top, right? So you'd be getting some protein and you'd be getting some carbohydrate there, and you could effectively do that. But it means you have to kind of work out, well, if I had 10 grams of fat left, what amount of calories can I then shift over to carbs? And you have to do that math. We developed an app actually that does all that for you, which is really convenient. But I think the beauty is that you can ultimately have that flexibility. I will say there's one downside to people that choose to kind of have more, of a flux in their dietary intake, and that is just due to how carbohydrate and how dietary fiber impacts our body weight on the scale. Unfortunately, I guess it depends on how you look at this, when we consume carbohydrate and there's no longer an immediate need for that carbohydrate, it's obviously stored in our muscle tissue and our liver as glycogen. So glycogen is stored with water. And for every 1 gram of glycogen that is stored, we also store it with, somewhere in the realm of say 2.5 to 2.7 mil of water. That's just how glycogen is stored inside the tissues. So we tend to see people's weight jump up, even if calories are equated and they're having the same amount of protein, just because they're trading out more of those fats and putting them towards carbs. Even though the energy density is very similar, you still see your weight move on the scale. And that terrifies a lot of people, particularly when they're not educated about, how carbohydrates are stored. So, I think it can make it more difficult for people that perhaps they're in a fat loss phase and they're going through the motions of their diet. And then one day they decide to have more carbohydrates and they take out lots of their fats. And maybe that also means that they eat more dietary fiber. If we think about where dietary fiber comes from, it's predominantly our, carbohydrate-based foods. So we would not only then see a big shift in stored muscle glycogen and water, but now we've also got more food coming in that is going to sit in the digestive tract that has a physical weight associated with it, and people's weight can jump up, by a meaningful number of percent. So I think once people have that understanding that, oh, my weight could actually go up by 1 or 2%, from one day to the next, just because of my macronutrient distribution, it gives them a bit more sense of comfort and ease, because now, you're empowered, you're informed, you've got that knowledge. So it kind of helps people with that fear of the scale. And then they can start to justify it a little bit more. And I think, I've certainly seen that in the people that I'm working with.
I definitely want to come on to that in a moment, actually, in terms of the mindset and them feeling comfortable in terms of tracking, and also your own experience with kind of body sort of issues and things, and just surrounding mental health. But before we do that, when you're describing that actually they would, in that situation, weigh a bit heavier on the scales, would they then notice, like if they're looking for that really lean and defined look, by increasing carbohydrates and drawing in more of that water, how would that affect the aesthetics when they're looking in the mirror?
Absolutely. So you will see a visual shift. Now, I guess one of the interesting things about this is that, if we look at, our elite athletes, so your top physique athletes, part of the protocol leading into getting on stage is a carb loading period. Now, you might be wondering, well, okay, she's just said we're eating all these carbs and it brings a lot of water. I wonder what that does to somebody's physique. Well, in an adequate amount, it's actually going to make the muscle appear nice and full and round. And that's exactly what you want to see on stage. The last thing you want to see is a really flat, depleted muscle, because it has no shape about it. But when we eat in, I guess, a surplus, or, outside of what our normal carbohydrate consumption is, instead of that carbohydrate and water moving into the intracellular space of our tissue, it ends up sitting in the extracellular space. So that is when we start to see some of those kind of blurred lines. You might be used to seeing a lot more definition in your legs. And I would use the same example as if you've done a really hard workout and you've got that acute inflammatory response to training and your legs are all puffy and they're full and tight, that can kind of distort the look of a defined muscle. So I know for me, if I go out and have sushi and I've had a ton of carbohydrate, and then let's add some salts and sodium to that, which also draws in a lot more water, I just look like a watermelon. So like I can go
I can't believe that.
within the matter of minutes, it's like you can look very defined, and I can see like some feathering in my thigh. And then all of a sudden, if I try to flex my thigh, it's like, oh, where do my muscles go? And it's not that you've added body fat, but it can look like that. And I think that's a very stark difference for when people look in the mirror. So, you know, I think once people have that understanding that, oh, if I eat a lot of carbohydrates all at once, like I go out for a big dinner and it's super salty, like you're probably going to look a little bit, you know, washed out probably the next day. So it's difficult, you know, to see that in the mirror. But again, I think that's why knowledge is power, and it helps you, you know, give yourself a little bit more compassion, because you're not sitting there going, oh my gosh, I've put on all this body fat. Now, I even know for me, if I do put on a bit of body fat, it's not the end of the world. I'm like, I'm a human. It's part of my body's processes. But I think as you're kind of in that recovery phase and learning to accept your body, you know, as it is, wherever it is on the scale, however much your body fat percentage is, I think that's a nice way to kind of start to ease that negativity that's associated with an increased, you know, scale weight, or just seeing your body change in response to certain types of foods.
For sure. I'm so glad you clarified that. Thank you. When we're looking at mental health, because obviously it is a big issue for many people, and particularly if, you know, they historically as teenagers, I think many of us, me included, kind of were restricting our food intake and things. It's really difficult to leave that part of you behind. How do you approach that with your clients in terms of them tracking what they're eating and their macros and their overall calories without them becoming obsessed? I know you said you have an app as well that's helpful. How do you approach that?
Yeah, so I think honestly, like the most important thing is like learn. You've got to learn and know about your client, and you have to be able to meet them where they are at. And that range, that spectrum is, you know, very spanning. So I think it depends on, you know, that individual. But let's take an example of somebody that is, you know, extremely, you know, body focused. There's a lot of, I guess, negative associations with their physique. Maybe there's a lot of value, self-worth tied into their physical appearance. Those people are, it's really difficult to work with, not because it's challenging as a coach, I think, to be able to kind of tap in and break into their mindset and understand the narrative. But once there is an established trust and, you know, open communication, and I honestly try to be really transparent in my own, you know, journeys myself, and then examples of other clients. I think once you can establish that trust, then you can start to kind of the client feels more comfortable to start sharing, you know, what's really going on in their mind. And one of the little tasks I think that I start off with for anybody that's brand new is to just start to tap into their self-awareness. And often that means really slowing down. I think everybody today is hustle, hustle, hustle. You know, we're always rushing and running around. And we tend to kind of switch over into like a default mode or autopilot. So that really takes us away from like our conscious thought. And now we're kind of, you know, doing all these things on a day-to-day basis, like almost subconsciously. It just happens out of our habit. So step one is really getting them to move back into their conscious mind and start listening to what they're saying. So I will have them report to me, okay, what are 3 things that you've noticed that you tell yourself that are, you know, negative? And they might come back at a check-in and say, well, you know, I was standing in front of the mirror and I recall myself saying, you know, yuck, oh my gosh, my body looks so gross. Oh, I'm so fat. Oh, my clothes don't fit me very well. So we start to kind of identify the narrative and some of the language and what they're kind of telling themselves, like what are their beliefs of themselves. And then we start to push back on some of those narratives. And another homework task would be, okay, I want you to come up with, for the 3 things that you've identified that are negative, I want you to think of 3 things that you can say that would, push back on that comment, that would try to, negate that. So they'll come up with something that they can say, so that now we're kind of bringing in new thoughts. And ultimately, if you've had an established behavior for a really long time, or a certain belief for a really long time, those thoughts are very automatic. We don't have a lot of control over the thoughts that are coming into our mind, but what we can do is control the thoughts that we add to. So over time, I think the more we can kind of hear those other voices, and I'll call them like affirmations, or some kind of I guess mindset shift that they want. I'll have people put little stickers all over their mirrors, or they'll have like something that's available to them all the time, or like sticky notes on their fridge. Just that repetitiveness of this new thought, eventually over time they will start to believe it. And originally, when you first start this, I think it kind of feels like a bit of imposter syndrome, and you do not believe what you're telling yourself. But if people stick with it and they really are like determined to feel differently about their body and about themselves and their value and their worth, if they continue to work at it, eventually over time, their narrative does change, those beliefs do change, and then now they're this new person, and the predominant thought are the positive ones. So it's quite a process. But as far as I know that you'd asked specifically about like macro tracking, I think that some people are really in a position to, track at the same time. Like they like that. That's the one sense of control that they still have. So I think, removing that all of a sudden is not a good strategy. I think it's something that you have to do pretty gradually. So I might start out with reducing your tracking for 1 meal per day. So maybe they track for 3 meals, and then their 4th meal, they don't track. And then eventually over time, we might progress them to not tracking any meals, and it's just 1 day of the week. So, that would be trying to shift somebody away from, the need to control their food intake and their body, and allowing them to develop a better sense of trust within themselves, that they don't actually need this tool anymore. And then over that time, we're also working on establishing a new way of thinking. And then, within a good amount of time, probably like 12 months to 18 months, now we've got this individual that feels extremely positive about their bodies. They don't feel like they need to be tracking all the time. But, it's a tool that they can, pull out if and when they need it. So
on a long-term basis, then it sounds like you're not a huge advocate of constant tracking in terms of, do you find that people develop, because whenever I try to track, and I've worked with a trainer and they're like, well, have you tracked your calories? That's the real, that I can make all of the workout sessions. I can definitely dial in my protein because I can see on the aesthetics what difference it makes.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very difficult to consistently track my calories, basically, because I'm just like, I can't really be asked, you know what I mean, to like work it out and put it in.
Yeah, look, it is, I will say, I actually am a big advocate of people learning about what's in foods. And I think the best way to do that is to track. So, if somebody hasn't ever tracked calories, tracked macros, used a tracking app, I'd say there is so much value in doing that for a given period of time, because I think ultimately it helps them not only with, I guess, any aesthetic goal that they might have, but it also is going to educate them about, the nutritional composition of foods, and then the energy density of certain foods. And, that is a very good tool to have if we're thinking about how that might play out in the long term for our health, in reducing the risk of various diseases, cancers, cardiovascular disease, all those types of things. They're so prevalent in culture. And I think if you have an understanding of what it is you're taking in, at least then there's some informed choice. Now, do I think that people should track indefinitely? I'd say, I don't know, it probably depends on the person. I think what we've got to look at is the degree in which it is negatively affecting, their mental health and well-being, or their lifestyle in general. Because I know certain folks that, they've got a lifestyle where they don't have a whole lot of responsibilities, they don't have kids anymore, they've grown up, they're out of the house, and they have a lot more free time. So for them, tracking their macros is a very small inconvenience for a lot of gain. They're moving into their late 60s. They're feeling like they're living their best life. They can moderate their calorie intake. They're getting a good amount of protein, and they're feeling extremely strong and empowered and healthy. Now, if somebody is, a single mom and they have 4 children and she's working 2 jobs and she's trying to take care of her health, and tracking is just not working for her and it's giving her a lot of stress and anxiety, I'd say maybe that's not the best tool for somebody in that situation, or at least not for any lengthy period of time. I would still say to that woman, learn about food. Like, okay, let's do it at a slower pace. You would probably be a little bit more generous with the time frame to learn that new skill, and set more realistic expectations for her. And I think a lot of women are very tough on themselves too. So, they're probably looking up to all of their, social media influencers that are single, don't have partners, their job is their fitness. And they're like, why can't I be like that? I'm like, well, you're
so true. When you're talking about the mum with the kids, I'm like, yeah, that's me. 3 kids, 2 dogs, rushing around. Maybe that's why I'm not tracking my macros.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like I'm in that same boat. Like I guess lifestyle has changed so dramatically since, I was in my early 20s to where I am now. And I've been in the position where, I was a stepmom. I was managing 4 companies. I was trying to be a professional physique athlete. And I can tell you now, there was so much sacrifice, and that it almost wasn't worth the cost trying to do world championships and do all those things, because it required so much consistency and tracking and just time. So again, do I think that people should be striving for, the freedom not to track? I don't know whether I could say yes, because some people, it just works so well with their lifestyle. It's not an inconvenience, and they have a healthy relationship with that tracking. I think when it becomes a problem is if people don't have any other means of coping outside of that. I think if you were to take that away from somebody and they're experiencing extreme anxiety, it's starting to impact relationships, friendships. Maybe they're, skipping out on social outings because their phone's flat and they can't track their food. I think we've got to look at the extent to which it is impacting their life. And I would want to know that somebody has a healthy enough relationship with themselves, that they could be flexible if they needed to be. And I think I've worked with a lot of the people that are stuck in this place where they are terrified of letting go of tracking. So I'm not saying to them, I want you to stop tracking altogether, but I want you to develop the other skills to learn how to be okay without it. Let's find some moderation here. And where is that fear coming from? Is this because if you let go of that, you feel like, you're nothing without your body or your physique? Like, you really want to get to the why, so that we can start working on those things, because that's often a psychological, challenge that we can work through, and we can improve if they have the desire to do that.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a self-esteem issue.
Mm-hmm.
I guess as well, it's harder, isn't it, as well for parents, right? Because I've got teenage children, so I'm conscious not to be tracking because I don't want to instill in them kind of like what I did as a teenager. Do you know what I mean? Where I'm trying to really micromanage.
Mm-hmm.
With the calories overall, I want to kind of dive into the training in just a moment, but as a sort of segue, when we're looking at someone who wants fat loss versus somebody who's now trying to gain lean tissue, what have you found in terms of like, do we definitely need a surplus to be able to gain muscle mass? Can we do it at a kind of maintenance level with increased protein? And if we're trying to lose body fat, what do we need to do there?
Mm-hmm. So I think if we take this from the stance of an individual is now wanting to work on adding muscle mass, Whether or not they need to be in a surplus or not actually, again, depends on the individual. And the reason for that is there are a few subsets or population groups that are able to build muscle very successfully without very much dietary intervention. And that is somebody that's brand new to resistance training. So I guess the new stimulus from resistance training, for instance, is so strong that the body is able to grow muscle very successfully in comparison to somebody that is more steady state resistance trained. And, you know, they've been working at it for a really long time. So it is unfortunately something that comes with diminishing returns. So the more muscular you become, the longer you've been training, you kind of get to a point where you're just kind of oscillating in this like maintenance mode, and you may be able to see small increases at the elite end for short periods of time with very intentional, very focused training, but it's not really something that can be maintained. So basically, I would suggest that what we would see is that their weight and the muscularity kind of drops back down and kind of just hovers for a while. So there's those two distinct groups. The other group of individuals that may not necessarily need to jump into a calorie surplus immediately would be somebody that has a higher body fat percentage. And the reason for that is they already have, by way of excess adipose tissue, a wonderful reserve of energy. So they've kind of got the caloric cushioning available to them so that when they do jump into resistance training and they're providing, you know, an adequate training stimulus, they're training at a good intensity, they have this reserve of energy that can then be repetitioned towards the purposes of building muscle. So I might say to somebody that comes to me and maybe they're sitting at, I don't know, let's say 30% body fat. I might just look at their current maintenance calories, and provided that their current caloric intake is meeting all of their essential needs and that they're within what we would consider like a normal range of calories based on their lean body mass, I might just say, we're going to stay here actually. And we're just going to put you into a really great resistance training program. And let's just let time do its thing. So you don't always need to be in a surplus, but for somebody that is lower body fat percentage, and I will specifically reference a lot of the competitors. So maybe they've just come through a really, extreme diet. They've been on stage, they've gotten down to a very low body fat percentage. Somebody at that extreme doesn't have the fat reserves or the fat storage available to help with that building and that regeneration of new tissue. So therefore, we do need a calorie surplus coming in to be able to provide that energy towards the process of building tissue. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. And, you know, as you were saying this, I was thinking about myself, because we can come on to like how you measure body composition in a moment. But I did recently, because I'm doing a whole set of like longevity testing and labs and things. And I did a DEXA scan on myself. And then I also did an in-body scan to see. Mm-hmm. And my muscle mass looked pretty good in certain areas. Obviously, the DEXA is really good at showing you kind of exactly where. Mm-hmm. But there was a difference between the two. They're meant to be, I think, within like a 1% difference. And yet when I did the DEXA, it was coming at around 19%. And then when I did the in-body, I don't believe this is right, it was like 14.5%. So my guess is somewhere in between. But what I've noticed, and it's interesting what you were saying there, is when I looked at the DEXA, actually an area to build up was the strength in my back. And that's the bit that I've really struggled with. And I've been training for a long time. Like you were saying, it's harder to make those modifications. And what I'm finding is I can move up on, you know, my glute bridges and things like that and get heavier and heavier. But when I'm looking at my back, I can do a few kind of unassisted pull-ups, but I can't seem to progress much more. Like if I'm doing a lat pull down, I'm really struggling. And I'm guessing part of that is actually coming down to the fueling.
Mm-hmm. It's very possible. I mean, you just said what, 17% versus 14 on the different machines. That's not a whole lot of body fat and energy available too. And then I think we've got to look at, in addition to, your current body fat levels, what are your other activities? Are you just focusing on resistance training? Are you also incorporating some kind of other cardiovascular exercise and activity? Because that all has an energy requirement as well. So again, if there isn't a lot of consistency in someone's training program, for instance, and some weeks they're going out for, an hour walk with their girlfriends, and another week they're going to go and do a HIIT class or a boxing group class or something, and if there isn't consistency, that means that then there's inconsistent energy available if you are still, trying to get through those workouts. So I think the best approach, honestly, for somebody that's looking to add muscle is to make sure, number one, that you are, eating an adequate amount of calories. And the reference range that I like to use for my clients to kind of gauge you're in a good place based on a moderate to high amount of activity is, and I'm going to use kilograms because that's how I work, but anywhere from say 35 calories per kilogram of lean body mass, all the way up to say 45 calories per kilogram of lean body mass. That's kind of what I'm striving for my clients' maintenance. And then when they're in that place, then I'd say, okay, well, if the goal is now to build muscle, we want to be in a small surplus above that. Can we do that by your existing body fat stores, or do we need to push a little bit higher so that we do have some more energy available for the purposes of building muscle? And then during that building phase, I would also say that it's probably important to minimize the amount of higher intensity interval training or HIIT training, just high intensity training in general, because that has been shown to directly impede mTOR signaling pathways, which is important for that process of muscle building. Now, that works along a spectrum. Most of the studies that we've looked at for purposes of muscle building that are showing, that concurrent training. So we've got a group of participants that are doing, resistance training, 3 to 5 times per week, and then they're doing some kind of cardiovascular work with it. Unfortunately, not a lot of the studies are incorporating the levels of cardio that at least I'm seeing in the types of patients and clients that I'm working with. The people that I see tend to do a whole lot more. So in these studies, it's usually 30 minutes of moderate intensity cardio daily. And in those cases, there isn't actually a whole lot of interference effect. But again, if you were doing, 4 hours, which I've seen, and it's terrifying to think that there are coaches out there prescribing 2 hours a day of cardio plus resistance training 7 days a week. I've seen this. In that circumstance, even though it's just moderate intensity, steady state cardio, because of the total amount that's being performed, I just don't think that there, and again, I can't say for sure because I haven't seen any studies that show that kind of, extreme cardio intervention. But that's probably going to, if you want my opinion, have some negative impact on their ability to recover from resistance training. And same if you're doing, an hour of HIIT cardio, 6 days a week, which again, I've seen that. People are getting prescribed 60 minutes of intervals on the Stairmaster daily, and their resistance training, and they're in a calorie deficit. Those things are likely to really negatively impact someone's, energy availability for the purposes of muscle recovery.
That's really important. I'm so glad you clarified that, because I remember speaking to Dr. Stacey Sims about this, and I've done her programs about low energy availability. And she's very much a fan of exercise being purposeful and intentional. And I think that as a mum, it's quite easy to trip into doing way more activity than you thought. I'll get to the end of the day and look at my Aura ring, particularly at a weekend, and I'm 22,000 steps in. And that on top of resistance training is probably quite a lot of energy demands, isn't it? But you're just busy with the kids and just generally doing stuff. And I guess, even though I know it and it's weird, it's almost like sometimes it takes someone to point out to you, actually, you're doing a lot on unintentionally, right? It's not like they were scheduled sessions, but you are kind of moving around a lot.
Yeah. And I think, a good gauge for knowing whether you're doing too much in that particular scenario would be are you noticing weight loss on the weekends? Because, obviously that's going to be a pretty big predicament or a predictor of energy availability. So, if you're trying to optimize your recovery for the purposes of building muscle, and, you're noticing that, specifically on 3 days of the week where you're a lot more active, and it might just be incidental movement where you're running errands, you're dropping the kids off at their, weekend sport, and then you're going for a walk with your girlfriend and you're doing your training or whatever it might be, like, that to me, I would probably say, like, monitor your weight. And then that would be one way that you could determine whether those days are, optimal or not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So then looking at the training, when people are looking at optimizing their training program and schedule, I guess the first thing I think that would be really helpful to explain to listeners is the difference between strength training, more power-based training, and hypertrophy training, and what results they can expect from doing this.
Yeah, so I think if we're looking specifically for outcomes of hypertrophy, so if you're doing your training, if you're being intentional about going into the gym because you want to build muscle, the good news about that is that I think it's generally agreed now across the scientific community that you can do a range of different rep ranges and still achieve really good results. So you can incorporate some strength-based rep ranges. So that is looking at, 1 to 6, typically with heavier loads, working close to failure, as well as working at that hypertrophy rep range. You're probably anywhere from, say, your 6 to 15, moderate training loads, and then all the way up to high rep ranges, 15 and above, at light loads. All of those different circumstances and styles of training have been shown to still elicit a great hypertrophy response. So I think the beauty of that is that whether you're somebody, and I know I've got friends, and it's usually males, they tend to be a little bit more ego driven. So they like to train in that strength rep range. Women, on the other hand, maybe we're a little bit more timid, though I've got plenty of friends that are definitely, I want to go and lift heavy today. But for the most part, I think women might prefer to work in that moderate rep range, moderate loads, and then maybe even in the higher rep ranges with light loads. So again, I think that's more just, from a historical standpoint where, lifting and resistance training has come from, at least for women. We probably started out with, the aerobic Oz style and, some of these kind of, TV shows where it's a little bit more cardiovascular. And that's just where women have kind of felt most comfortable because it's part of like a societal trend. But there's definitely been a lot more of a movement, I think, in recent years for women gravitating towards strength training because it is also really beneficial. And to me, it was a really empowering process. I've done multiple powerlifting competitions now and I love it. It's not something that I would want to do all the time, but part of my training now and how I would recommend to clients, if they like, diversity, which, I think a lot of people enjoy having an element of change in their program because it's exciting, it's new. The good thing is you can do all of the rep ranges. I think one of the key predictors, I guess, of muscle hypertrophy outcomes, making sure that you are progressively overloading over time. So you want to see your training volumes trending up, over your training age and years, but also making sure that as you're doing that, that you're also training at a high intensity. So working within, a perceived rate of exertion, which is the RPE scale, somewhere from 7.5, maybe up to 9.5. And occasionally it's probably okay if you hit a failure set at 10, you're going to failure. So yeah, that's kind of the way that I program. And I think all of the rep ranges have their value. If we were to look at strength as the number one priority outcome, then that's a little different. We do need to be working in that strength rep range in efforts to see strength improvements. So that's kind of like a skill, similarly said, if you're a professional soccer player or track sprinter, you want to be doing that sport, that, specific movement, that training style on a regular basis to improve that skill. So strength training is similar in that regard. But that being said, it's also not an invaluable I guess, exercise to also incorporate a little bit of hypertrophy-based, training as well, from an exercise diversity standpoint too.
And have you found, I know Stacey talks about like providing a really strong stimulus for women that are going through perimenopause or menopause, that because of that drop off in estrogen, they should be focusing on that kind of lower repetition, higher resistance training? Or have you found that actually you're getting good results when you're mixing up the rep ranges? I'm curious as to what you found with clients in that category.
I don't know that I've actually read any research that specifically focus on women going or that are in perimenopause and then different types of strength training. So I don't know that there are. But I can speak to that like anecdotally and just the clientele that I'm working with. And I would say that there are probably other strategies that I would personally probably go to first before I specifically jumped into you've got to do heavy strength training. I might be more inclined to have my clients provide like a subjective score report to me. So I often will look at their recoverability, their fatigue levels, their mood, their energy levels, I guess hunger and appetite, PMS, some of the women that are still, in that space experience negative symptoms, but they're just not getting an actual, menstrual cycle anymore. They're not having that bleed. So I tend to work with those clients a little bit more subjectively. And if we are I'm going to dance across to the literature in, menstrual cycle and different types of strength training. The results are quite mixed. I've read a couple of randomized control trials that show that women tend to have a decrease or reduction in strength around the time of their cycle, but I've also read randomized control trials that have shown no difference in strength. So I think it is something that, at least what we know at the moment, really subjective, and it's based upon the individual. So I think some coaches probably don't even ask those types of questions. So I think a really valuable, introduction into their coaching onboarding would be to kind of find out when their cycle is. In the past, have they experienced any negative symptoms? Generally, what's your energy like? How's your mood? And then I might even program, my deloads for a client around their period. So that there isn't that, pressure to be in there performing like an RPE 9, which even for me, like I've got to get myself psyched up, to do that on a good day. So if you're not feeling well, and then you've also got the physiological symptoms of pain and bloating and cramping, it's like, no. So I don't do any HIIT training personally, in the week leading up or during ovulation. Because it's just too painful. So, I've got specific times for me of the month where I'm like, okay, I know I can go hard. And that's something I never used to do, was track my cycle. So, that has been really advantageous about how I program. But for some women, it's not as much of a big deal. Some people don't get those extreme symptoms. So, relating this back to your question around women that are going through menopause, it is so individual, and I'm actually a big advocate of having them working with their healthcare team, specifically their endocrinologist, probably their OBG, and looking at ways where they can get their estrogen levels and their testosterone levels back to the normal reference range. Hormone replacement therapy, there's a lot of taboo and stigma. And I think, unfortunately, it's been created through lack of knowledge, lack of education. I think that information in the wrong hands has probably led this phenomenon of hormone replacement therapy being like steroids, and it's not the same thing. So, I would say probably 50% of the women that I'm working with in my team that are over, the age of 40 and they're not getting their cycle anymore, we're encouraging them to work with their doctors, find out what their blood biomarkers are saying, how can we improve these? We're already doing everything we can, dietary, and lifestyle from a standpoint. What else can we do to support you so that you feel your best? And most of them are starting to go into that process of getting their testosterone levels back to the normal reference range. And again, it's a therapeutic dose. We're not putting people into a place where they're achieving like super physiological, testosterone levels. It's no, they're just going back into how everybody else, is. So, you know, that makes a substantial difference to how they feel, their long-term performance, and ultimately if they're feeling better, guess what? They get better results because they're training hard, you know, they're able to be consistent, they're not fatigued all the time. You know, so I think there's a lot of things that we can do outside of like specific training intervention that can help with that.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. I always encourage women to go and get tested. Last question then before you go. You've been so generous with your time. Zone 2 training. I think I've even seen a photo of you. I think I listened to you with Peter Attia. He's obviously a massive, massive fan of Zone 2 for longevity. What are your thoughts then, just lastly, around cardio and how much we should be doing?
I think the answer to that is probably very vague and very broad. And I don't think that we know that there is a specific answer. I'm a huge advocate of incorporating some cardio. I think, you know, looking at all of the data about, you know, somebody's cardiovascular health and their VO2 max, those types of things, it is very consistently showing that it can have so many benefits across, you know, so many different, I guess, health conditions. So I have all of my clients, you know, trying to hit step targets, you know, up to the age of like 70. I've got women that are, you know, and they really enjoy it. And I think, you know, there's so many benefits of exercise, period. Not just the physiological ones, but, you know, from a psychological standpoint too. So I'm a big advocate of cardio. I do think that we need to, you know, everything in moderation. You know, some of my older clients now, you know, there is a focus on strength and building muscle, but we're not going at it like the perspective of a bodybuilder trying to be the most muscular. We're actually freeing up some of their time to also do some kind of cardiovascular work, some movement, and some mobility. They're trying to stay functional. So yeah, there is elements of cardio in some of my older clients' programs, and I think it's a massive value add. So I'm in line with Peter Attia's thoughts on Zone 2 training, but again, I think it depends on somebody's goals, because, you know, if someone came to me and they said, you know what, I want to be a world champion jiu-jitsu player, and but I also really think that I'd be pretty good at bodybuilding. Like, you know, there's only so many hours in the day, and I think sometimes we just have to set realistic expectations for our clients, and help them, you know, develop a solid plan that does a little bit of all elements of, you know, health and fitness. So yeah, I think Zone 2 is a great thing. I think some occasional HIIT training is also a great thing. The same way that I also think a little bit of resistance training, it's a great thing. So yeah.
About mixing it up. Amazing. Where can people find more about you, about your app, your coaching programs?
Yep. So everything that I have is listed on my Instagram page. So my Instagram is just Holly T Baxter. You'll be able to get access to the Carbon Diet Coach, which is my nutrition coaching app. You'll be able to get access to my team of coaches. So we have a chiropractor, physical therapist, exercise scientist, dietitians, all the good stuff. I still coach. And I guess then all of our books, educational material, products and services are on my website. So you can find all that in the link in my Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on, Holly. It's been such a joy speaking to you, and you've just got like such a wealth of knowledge and also real life experience, which is amazing to have those two things combined. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.